Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Some discoveries are made too late, long after the people involved have vanished, long after the questions should have been asked, long after anyone can provide answers that make sense. In the spring of 1894, a group of county officials and local volunteers descended into a network of tunnels beneath a remote ridge in the Missouri Ozarks, and what they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Several men fled before the exploration was complete. Others refused to speak of what they'd seen, taking their silence to the grave. And the official report, the document that should have explained everything, mysteriously disappeared from county archives within a year of being filed. The tunnels had been there for decades, hidden beneath the earth, carved by hands that worked in secret and died in mystery. They belonged to a family known only as the Ravenhills, a clan that appeared in the Ozarks in 1848 and vanished without trace barely a decade later, leaving behind only whispers, warnings, and a subterranean labyrinth that investigators would eventually seal permanently, as if by burying the entrance they could bury the truth of what happened there. Tonight, we're going to descend into that darkness. We're going to piece together the fragments of a story that someone, or something, didn't want told. This is the mystery of the Ravenhill clan and what was found in their tunnels beneath the Missouri earth, and it begins 46 years after the family vanished, when curiosity finally overcame fear, and men with lanterns decided to discover what had been hidden in the deep places of the world. April 17, 1894. Sheriff William Thorne of Taney County stood at the edge of a sinkhole that had opened during spring floods, staring down into darkness that seemed to swallow his lantern light before it could illuminate anything useful. The locals had been telling him for weeks that something was wrong with Ravenhill Ridge, that the ground was unstable, that sounds were coming from below, that the old stories about the family that used to live there weren't just stories after all. Thorne was a practical man, not given to superstition, but he was also thorough, and the complaints had been persistent enough to warrant investigation. So he'd gathered a group of men, deputies, a county surveyor, several volunteers who claimed to know the history of the ridge, and they'd come to see what, if anything, lay beneath the surface. What they found was an entrance. Not a natural cave formation, but something deliberately constructed, timber supports still intact after half a century, stone steps descending into the earth, and carved into the rock face above the opening, symbols that none of them recognized but all of them instinctively feared. "This ain't no mine," one of the volunteers said, a man named Jacob Parnell whose grandfather had lived in the area when the Ravenhills were still around. "My granddad told me stories about this place. Said the family that lived here weren't natural. Said they went into the ground one day and never came back out." Sheriff Thorne recorded this moment in his field journal, which survived despite the disappearance of the official report. "I felt a profound reluctance to proceed," he wrote. "Not fear exactly, but a deep, instinctive sense that some doors are meant to remain closed. Nevertheless, duty compelled me forward." They descended. The tunnel was narrow at first, barely wide enough for a grown man to pass through, but it opened into a passage that showed signs of extensive excavation. The walls weren't rough stone. They'd been worked, smoothed, carved with what must have been enormous effort, and everywhere they looked there were markings, symbols scratched into the rock, geometric patterns that seemed to spiral and repeat, and stranger still, what appeared to be writing in a script no one in the group could read. "It ain't English," the surveyor noted. "Ain't any language I recognize, but it's deliberate. This is written language or something approximating it." They pushed deeper, following the main passage as it branched into side tunnels. Some of them collapsed, others descending further into the earth. In one chamber they found the remnants of living quarters, rotted bedding, rusted tools, ceramic jars still sealed, their contents long since spoiled. In another, they discovered what appeared to be a workshop, with carved wooden implements whose purposes defied explanation. Some looked like ceremonial objects. Others seemed designed for purposes the men didn't want to contemplate. And then they found the first of the carvings. Not symbols this time, but figures. Life-sized representations of human forms carved directly into the stone walls, their features stylized but recognizable. There were dozens of them arranged in rows, all facing the same direction, deeper into the tunnel system, toward chambers the group hadn't yet reached. "They look like they're walking," one deputy observed, his voice barely above a whisper, "like they're marching towards something." But it was what they found in the deepest accessible chamber that caused several men to abandon the exploration entirely. Sheriff Thorne's description is clinical, almost detached, as if emotional distance was the only way he could process what he'd witnessed. A large circular room, approximately 30 feet in diameter. The floor descends in concentric rings toward a central pit, now partially collapsed. Around the perimeter, carved niches containing skeletal remains, animal and possibly human, though the state of preservation makes definitive identification difficult. In the center, surrounding the pit, a series of stone markers arranged in a pattern that suggests ritual purpose. And carved into every available surface, covering the walls from floor to ceiling, the same repeating symbols we'd seen throughout the tunnel system, but here more elaborate, more insistent, as if whoever made them was trying desperately to communicate something to whoever might eventually find this place. Two men refused to go further. They climbed back to the surface and wouldn't return, even when ordered. A third began experiencing what he described as overwhelming dread and had to be escorted out. The remaining members of the expedition pushed forward, but their exploration was cut short when a section of tunnel partially collapsed, nearly trapping them underground. They emerged after 6 hours below ground, shaken and silent. And when Sheriff Thorne compiled his findings into an official report, he included a recommendation that shocked the county officials who read it. The entrances should be sealed immediately, the site should be marked as hazardous, and under no circumstances should anyone attempt further exploration of the Ravenhill tunnels. Whatever this family was doing beneath the earth, Thorne wrote, it was not mining, not smuggling, not any activity that falls within conventional criminal enterprise. The evidence suggests something else entirely, ritualistic, obsessive, and conducted with a singularity of purpose that speaks to belief rather than profit. I cannot recommend in good conscience that we attempt to understand what that purpose was. Some discoveries are better left incomplete. Within months, all entrances to the tunnel system had been filled with rock and timber. Within a year, the official report had vanished from county records. And within a generation, the Ravenhill clan had passed from documented history into folklore, becoming just another strange story whispered in the Ozark Hills. Except this story was true, and the evidence of its truth lay buried beneath the earth, waiting. But to understand what the Ravenhills were doing underground, and why their activities inspired such fear, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to 1848, when the Ozarks were still frontier territory and a mysterious family arrived in Taney County, bringing with them secrets that would outlast their lives. The Missouri Ozarks in 1848 were a world of limestone ridges and hidden valleys, dense forests of oak and hickory, cold, clear streams cutting through ancient rock, and communities so isolated that the nearest neighbor might be a day's travel away. This was frontier land in the truest sense, beyond the reach of effective law enforcement, beyond the attention of government officials, a place where people could live and die without anyone outside their immediate area ever knowing they existed. The region had been open to settlement following the Louisiana Purchase, but progress was slow. The terrain was unforgiving. Farming was difficult on the thin, rocky soil. Transportation was limited to rough trails that became impassable in winter. The people who chose to settle here were either running from something or seeking isolation so complete that the outside world might as well not exist. The population was sparse and diverse, former frontiersmen pushing westward, families from Tennessee and Kentucky seeking cheap land, German immigrants establishing tight-knit communities, and those who simply didn't fit anywhere else, who needed a place where questions weren't asked and pasts could be buried beneath new identities. Law enforcement was virtually non-existent. A single county sheriff might be responsible for hundreds of square miles of difficult terrain. Justice was often handled locally, by community consensus or personal vendetta, rather than through any formal legal process. If a family wanted to live apart from society, wanted to conduct their affairs in secret, the Ozarks provided the perfect environment. Superstition ran deep in these isolated communities. The old European beliefs had crossed the Atlantic with the settlers, warnings about spirits and omens, folk magic passed down through generations, a worldview that saw supernatural forces at work in everyday events. The indigenous Osage people, displaced but not forgotten, had left their own stories embedded in the landscape, tales of spirits in the hills, sacred places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, caves that descended into darkness and should never be entered. Into this isolated, superstitious, lawless environment, the Ravenhills arrived with almost no introduction and even less explanation. The Ozark communities operated on an informal network of information. News traveled slowly but thoroughly. Who had married whom, which family was struggling, where good hunting could be found, which settlers were reliable and which should be avoided. But the Ravenhills entered this network as complete blanks. They arrived, they settled, and they offered almost nothing about who they were or where they'd come from. The terrain itself made their isolation possible. Ravenhill Ridge, a name that was applied retroactively, as the family never called it anything, was a particularly remote section of limestone upland, accessible only by rough trails through dense forest. The ridge was pockmarked with sinkholes and cave openings, as much of the Ozarks were, the result of millennia of water carving through soluble rock. It was considered poor land for farming, too rocky and steep for effective cultivation. Most settlers avoided it, which made it perfect for anyone who wanted to be left alone. The environment would prove crucial to the Ravenhill story, because in the Ozarks, the boundary between surface and subsurface was often uncertain. The limestone bedrock was riddled with caves, underground streams, natural chambers that could extend for miles beneath the surface. Exploring these formations was dangerous, collapses were common, flooding was a constant risk, and it was easy to become lost in the darkness. Most settlers wisely avoided venturing deep into the cave systems, but the Ravenhills, as investigators would eventually discover, had no such hesitation. They embraced the underground. They expanded it. They made it their home in ways that suggested the surface world was merely where they performed the minimum necessary activities to avoid attention, while their true lives, their true purposes, unfolded in the hidden places beneath the earth. The Ozarks in 1848 were already a landscape of secrets. The Ravenhill clan would add one more, buried so deep that it would take half a century to uncover even a fraction of the truth. The first recorded mention of the Ravenhill family appears in the personal journal of Elias Thornton, a traveling preacher who made regular circuits through the Ozark communities. His entry from June 1848 is brief but telling. Encountered a new family established on the ridge above Crooked Creek. They call themselves Ravenhill, though I suspect this may be an adopted name rather than ancestral. The family consists of a patriarch, stern, perhaps 50 years of age, who introduces himself only as Father Ravenhill, a woman of similar age who speaks not at all, and approximately 8 to 10 younger individuals whose exact relationships I could not determine. They declined my offer of prayer and spiritual guidance. When I inquired about their plans for the land, the patriarch informed me they intended to establish a permanent foundation for our work. When pressed on the nature of this work, he became hostile and asked me to leave. I felt an uneasiness about this family that I cannot fully explain. Other mentions from this period paint a similar picture. The Ravenhills arrived with wagons and supplies but few possessions of sentimental or decorative value. They built quickly and efficiently, not a single large cabin, as was typical, but multiple smaller structures arranged in a rough circle on the ridge. Neighbors who observed them from a distance noted that they worked primarily at dawn and dusk, remaining inside during the brightest hours of the day. They were pale as ghosts, recalled Sarah Drummond in an interview conducted decades later when she was an elderly woman. My family had land about 3 miles from where they settled, and sometimes we'd see them on the trails. Adults and children alike, all of them had this same pallid complexion, like they never saw the sun, and they moved quiet. You'd be walking through the woods and suddenly they'd just be there, watching you with these flat, cold expressions. They never threatened anyone, never said an unkind word. They just looked at you like you were something they were studying, something they were trying to understand but found ultimately uninteresting. The family's economy was mysterious. They didn't farm in any significant way. The small garden plots they maintained couldn't possibly feed the number of people living on the ridge. They didn't trade much with neighbors or at the distant general store. They didn't hunt or trap for profit, yet they clearly had resources. Where these resources came from remained unclear, leading to the inevitable speculation that they'd brought wealth from wherever they'd come from, or that they were engaged in some kind of illegal enterprise. But it was their behavior, particularly their nocturnal activities, that first sparked serious concern among the scattered neighbors. Multiple families reported seeing lights on Ravenhill Ridge long after dark. Not hearth fires visible through cabin windows, but moving lights, like lanterns or torches, appearing and disappearing among the trees and, strangely, seeming to emerge from and descend into the ground itself. We'd see the lights dancing on the ridge, testified Marcus Weaver, whose family lived in the valley below. Sometimes a dozen or more, moving in patterns like they was conducting some kind of ceremony. And we'd hear sounds, chanting maybe, or singing, but not in English. It had a rhythm to it, rising and falling, and it would go on for hours. My father forbade us from going anywhere near that ridge after dark, said whatever the Ravenhills were doing was none of our business and best left alone. The sounds were corroborated by multiple sources. Low rhythmic vocalizations, sometimes accompanied by what witnesses described as drumming or the striking of stones together. The sounds would echo strangely through the valleys, making it difficult to pinpoint their exact source, but they clearly originated from the Ravenhill property. Children in neighboring families began having nightmares about the Ravenhills. They described dreams of being underground, of walking through endless tunnels lit by cold lights, of voices calling to them from beneath their beds. Parents dismissed these as typical childhood fears amplified by the mysterious neighbors, but the consistency of the nightmares was unsettling. Different children, who rarely interacted with each other, describing remarkably similar visions. Then the livestock incidents began. Sheep and cattle in pastures near the ridge were found dead, their bodies exhibiting injuries that local farmers couldn't explain. These weren't typical predator kills, no throat wounds, no signs of feeding. Instead, the animals appeared to have been drained of blood, with small, precise incisions that suggested deliberate butchery. And around several of the carcasses, witnesses reported finding symbols drawn in the dirt, geometric patterns that matched nothing in their experience. I found one of my cows dead about a quarter-mile from the Ravenhill property, testified Jonas Pritchard. It was lying on its side, unmarked except for a small cut on the neck, and the ground around it had been disturbed, swept clean actually like someone had erased their tracks. But at the 4 points of the compass around the animal, someone had arranged stones in careful stacks. Why would anyone do that? What purpose could it serve? I reported it to the local magistrate, but nothing came of it. Couldn't prove the Ravenhills had anything to do with it, even though everyone knew. The family's interactions with neighbors, rare as they were, took on increasingly unsettling qualities. When traders or neighbors approached the ridge, they were met by 2 or 3 family members who would emerge from the structures and politely, but firmly indicate that visitors were not welcome. They never invited anyone into their buildings. They conducted all business, and there was very little of it outdoors, in full view but at a distance that prevented anyone from seeing into their living spaces. One trader, Samuel Croft, recorded an encounter in his account book that hints at the strangeness of the family's situation. Delivered supplies to Ravenhill settlement as requested, flour, salt, lamp oil in quantities larger than typical. Payment in silver coin, which they produced from a leather pouch without counting, as if the cost was irrelevant. Noted that several of the family members, particularly the younger ones, had dirt embedded beneath their fingernails and on their clothing, not typical farming dirt but a pale limestone dust. When I inquired if they were excavating a root cellar, the patriarch became immediately hostile and informed me my services would no longer be required. I did not return. The limestone dust. In retrospect, this detail is crucial evidence that the family was already, within months of their arrival, working underground in an extensive way. But at the time, it was just another peculiarity in a growing list of peculiarities that marked the Ravenhills as different, other, and increasingly suspect. By 1850, barely 2 years after their arrival, the Ravenhill clan had become a source of fear and speculation throughout the scattered communities of that part of the Ozarks. They were the subject of warnings passed from parent to child. Stay away from the ridge, don't speak to them if you encounter them on the trails, don't follow their lights at night. The family had become, in essence, local bogeymen, present enough to be frightening, secretive enough to fuel imagination. But imagination, as it turned out, fell short of reality, because while neighbors whispered and speculated, the Ravenhills were engaged in something far stranger and more extensive than anyone guessed. They were building, not on the surface, where everyone could see, but beneath it, in the darkness and silence of the earth, they were creating something that would outlast their lives and defy explanation for generations. The whispers in the woods began as isolated incidents but grew into a pattern that even the most skeptical settlers couldn't ignore. The Ozarks had always been a place of strange sounds, owls calling in the night, the scream of a mountain lion, the crack of falling timber echoing through the valleys. But what people heard near Ravenhill Ridge was different, unnatural. Wrong in a way that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the oldest, most instinctive parts of the human brain. It started with the chanting. Multiple families, living miles apart with no regular communication between them, independently reported hearing the same thing. Rhythmic vocalizations rising from the ridge on certain nights, following a pattern that sounded almost like language, but in no tongue anyone recognized. The sounds would begin around midnight and continue until just before dawn, sometimes growing in intensity, sometimes falling to barely audible whispers, but maintaining that same hypnotic rhythm throughout. It wasn't like church singing, testified Elizabeth Hawkins, whose family lived about 4 miles from the ridge. It wasn't joyful or worshipful. It was repetitive and hollow, like the voices were coming from somewhere deep underground, traveling up through the rock itself. My husband tried to convince me it was just the wind, but wind doesn't have words and these sounds had structure, had meaning, even if we couldn't understand it. Whatever the Ravenhills were saying, they were saying it over and over, night after night, like they were trying to make something happen through pure repetition. The local folklore that grew around the family drew heavily on old European superstitions transplanted to American soil. The Ravenhills were witches, some said, practicing dark arts brought from the old country. Others claimed they were a religious sect, following beliefs so heretical they had to hide in the wilderness to avoid persecution. A few whispered that they weren't entirely human, that they were something older that had learned to imitate human form but couldn't quite get the details right. Children began reporting encounters that their parents desperately wanted to dismiss as imagination, but couldn't entirely explain away. A girl named Martha Grayson claimed she'd been picking berries near the base of the ridge when she saw three Ravenhill children emerge from what looked like solid ground. One moment the forest floor was undisturbed. The next moment a section of it had lifted away like a trapdoor, and three pale young people climbed out, carrying baskets of stones. They looked directly at her, she insisted, and one of them had smiled before all three descended back into the earth and closed the entrance behind them. My parents said I'd imagined it, Martha recounted years later. But I know what I saw. They came from underneath. And the stones they were carrying weren't regular stones. They were covered in markings, carved symbols that looked like letters but weren't any alphabet I'd ever seen. I had nightmares about those children for years. They weren't threatening, but they weren't normal either. They moved too smoothly, didn't blink enough, and when they smiled, it was like they were copying the expression without understanding what it meant. The livestock mutilations continued and escalated. Between 1850 and 1853, more than 30 animals were found dead under mysterious circumstances in the areas surrounding the Ravenhill property. The pattern was consistent: bloodless carcasses, small precise incisions, and strange arrangements of stones or sticks around the bodies. County records from the period, fragmentary as they are, include multiple formal complaints filed by farmers who suspected the Ravenhills but could provide no proof. Then came the disappearances, not frequent enough to constitute an obvious crisis, but enough to create an undercurrent of dread that eventually would contribute to the family's dark reputation. Between 1851 and 1856, 4 people vanished in the general vicinity of Ravenhill Ridge under circumstances that were never adequately explained. The first was a drifter, a man named Colin Pierce who'd been working odd jobs for various families in the area. He was last seen walking in the direction of the ridge, claiming he'd heard there might be work available with the Ravenhills. He never arrived at his next employer's homestead. A brief search found no trace of him, and since drifters commonly moved on without notice, his disappearance was initially attributed to normal frontier mobility. The second case was more troubling. Samuel Brennan, a teenage boy from a respected local family, went missing after telling friends he intended to spy on the Ravenhill settlement to discover what they were hiding. His body was found 3 weeks later at the base of a sinkhole, his neck broken in what authorities ruled an accidental fall. But those who saw the body noted details that didn't align with a simple fall. His boots were gone. His hands were clean despite lying in dirt for weeks, and there was an expression on his face that witnesses described as somewhere between terror and ecstasy, as if he'd seen something overwhelming in his final moments. The third and fourth disappearances, an elderly woman who'd been gathering herbs near the ridge and a traveling tinker who'd camped in the area, were never resolved at all. They simply vanished, leaving behind belongings but no bodies, no trails, no explanations. Official records reflect growing concern among local authorities, but also a hesitation to take direct action. A letter from the county magistrate to the territorial governor, dated 1854, reveals the dilemma. We have a family living in isolation whose behavior concerns many residents, but they have committed no provable crimes. They pay their limited taxes, they obey such laws as can be enforced in this remote region, and their strangeness, while unsettling, is not in itself illegal. Short of evidence of actual wrongdoing, I am uncertain how to proceed. The complaints against them are based largely on superstition and fear of the unfamiliar. Yet I confess, the consistency of these complaints and the genuine terror they inspire gives me pause. The pause would last for years. The Ravenhills continued their mysterious existence, neither fully part of the community nor entirely separate from it, a constant presence on the ridge that grew more ominous with each passing season. And beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, they continued their work, whatever that work was, expanding their underground domain, carving their symbols, pursuing their unknown purpose with a dedication that suggested absolute belief in whatever they were trying to achieve. The folklore that developed around them became self-reinforcing. Parents warned children, who grew into adults who warned their own children, creating generations of learned fear that outlasted the family itself. Stories multiplied and mutated. The Ravenhills could appear and disappear at will. They could control animals. They could enter your dreams if you spoke their name 3 times. They were building a doorway to hell beneath the Ozarks. Most of these stories were exaggerations, products of isolation and superstition. But some of them, as investigators would eventually discover, were closer to truth than anyone wanted to believe. In the spring of 1856, a government surveyor named Thomas Whitmore arrived in Taney County with a mandate to map potential routes for roads and assess land for future development. He was educated, experienced, and thoroughly rational, exactly the kind of person who would dismiss local superstitions as ignorant folklore. He lasted 3 weeks before he vanished, leaving behind notes that would become crucial evidence in the eventual understanding of what the Ravenhills had created beneath the earth. Whitmore's journal, recovered from his abandoned camp, documents his methodical surveying work and his growing fascination with geological anomalies he discovered near Ravenhill Ridge. His early entries are professional and detached: measurements, soil compositions, notations about rock formations. But as he worked closer to the ridge, his tone shifts, becoming more curious and then increasingly disturbed. May 7, 1856, discovered a series of sinkholes in an unusual pattern near the ridge settlement. While sinkholes are common in limestone regions, these appear to follow a geometric arrangement that suggests either remarkable coincidence or deliberate creation. I attempted to survey the interior of one accessible sinkhole and found evidence of modification: tool marks on the walls, timber supports, carved steps descending beyond the reach of my plumb line. This is not natural formation. May 12, 1856, met with the family inhabiting the ridge. They were hostile to my presence and insisted I leave the area immediately. The patriarch claimed the land was private property and my survey was trespassing. I explained my government authority, but this seemed only to increase their agitation. I noted approximately 12 individuals, all exhibiting a pallid complexion and nervous demeanor. They were unanimous in their desire for me to depart. Most unsettling was their insistence that I not enter any of the sinkholes or disturb what lies beneath. This phrasing struck me as oddly specific. May 14, 1856. Against my better judgment, I descended into the largest sinkhole system. What I found defies easy explanation. The natural cave has been extensively modified, passages have been widened, chambers have been carved from solid rock, and everywhere there are markings. Symbols etched into the stone walls, arranged in patterns that suggest linguistic meaning. The depth of the system is extraordinary. I followed one passage for what I estimate to be a quarter mile, before losing courage and returning to the surface. The passage was descending steeply, and I began hearing sounds from deeper in the system, movement, possibly voices, though distorted by the acoustics. Someone has created a subterranean complex of significant scale. For what purpose, I cannot fathom. May 17, 1856. I have made a discovery that troubles me deeply. Using my surveying equipment, I have triangulated the positions of multiple sinkholes and cave entrances in this area. They are arranged in a precise geometric pattern, a series of concentric circles with radii differing by consistent intervals, centered on a point beneath the Ravenhill settlement. This cannot be coincidence. This is deliberate design on a scale that would require years of labor and extensive knowledge of the underlying geology. What are these people building? And why? Whitmore's final entry is dated May 19, 1856. I intend to confront the family directly and demand explanation of the subterranean activity. As a government official, I have authority to investigate any activities that may pose public hazard. If they refuse cooperation, I will return with law enforcement. The scope of what I've discovered suggests either an elaborate mining operation conducted without proper authorization or something else entirely. The symbols that pervade the tunnels disturb me more than I can articulate. They remind me of nothing so much as ritual markings, religious inscriptions meant to sanctify or protect. But protect what? And from what? Thomas Whitmore was never seen again. His camp was found abandoned 3 days later, his surveying equipment still in place, his horse tied and unharmed, but the man himself gone. His journal was discovered in his tent, along with several sketches he'd made of the symbols he'd seen underground. These sketches would later prove crucial in identifying the markings found by the 1894 expedition. A search party was organized, led by the county sheriff at the time, a man named Robert Chandler. The searchers focused on the sinkhole areas Whitmore had been investigating. What they found was both enlightening and deeply unsettling. Multiple cave entrances that Whitmore had documented were now blocked. Fresh rockfalls had sealed the openings, but the rocks weren't naturally fallen. They'd been deliberately stacked and in some cases mortared into place. Someone had spent considerable effort closing these entrances after Whitmore's disappearance. The timing was impossible to ignore. "We attempted to clear one of the blocked entrances," Sheriff Chandler reported. "But the Ravenhills appeared en masse, the entire family, perhaps 15 individuals, and physically prevented us from proceeding. They claimed the caves were unstable, and that entering them would result in collapse and death. When I asserted my legal authority to investigate a missing person, the patriarch informed me that Whitmore had been warned to stay away, that he'd ignored warnings, and that his fate was the result of his own foolish curiosity. This phrasing implied they knew what had happened to him. When pressed, they insisted they knew nothing but that the underground areas were dangerous and best left undisturbed. Without evidence of foul play, no body, no witnesses to violence, no proof that Whitmore had even encountered the Ravenhills after his final journal entry, the sheriff had no legal basis to force his way into the sealed tunnels. The case remained officially unsolved, though local opinion was unanimous. The Ravenhills had killed Thomas Whitmore or allowed the caves to kill him, and then they'd sealed the evidence. The incident marked a turning point. Prior to Whitmore's disappearance, the Ravenhills had been feared and avoided but not actively confronted. After it, they were seen as genuinely dangerous, a threat that somehow remained beyond the reach of law enforcement. Several families moved away from the region entirely, unwilling to live near people they believed were capable of murder. Others began organizing, discussing ways to force the family to leave or, if necessary, to take more direct action. But before anything could be organized, nature, or something else, intervened. Because in the autumn of 1857, the entire Ravenhill clan vanished, leaving behind one of the most disturbing disappearance mysteries in Ozark history. October 1857. The exact date is uncertain because no one was watching the Ravenhill property closely enough to pinpoint the precise moment the family disappeared. What is certain is that in early October, neighboring families noticed the usual nocturnal activities. The lights on the ridge, the rhythmic sounds, had ceased. After several days of unusual quiet, curiosity overcame caution, and a small group of men approached the settlement to investigate. They found a ghost town. The structure stood empty, doors hanging open, belongings scattered as if the occupants had left in the middle of daily activities. In one cabin, a meal sat half-prepared on a table, the food spoiled but the arrangement intact. In another, clothing lay folded on rough-hewn beds, tools leaned against walls. Personal items, the small possessions that make a house a home, remained in place. But every single member of the family was gone. No bodies, no signs of violence or struggle, no indication of where they'd gone or why. Just absence where 15 human beings had been. It was like they'd been raptured, testified Michael Brennan, father of the boy who died near the ridge years earlier. Like they'd just risen up and vanished into thin air, but we knew better. We knew where they'd gone. Because the most disturbing discovery was this: multiple cave entrances on the property stood open. Entrances that had previously been hidden or blocked were now clearly visible, as if someone had deliberately revealed them. And leading into these entrances, the searchers found tracks, footprints in the soft cave mud, dozens of them, all leading inward deeper into the earth, none leading out. "We followed the tracks into the largest entrance," testified Joshua Hammond, one of the search party. "We didn't go far, maybe 100 feet, but far enough to see that the prints just kept going, descending into the earth. There were prints of different sizes, men, women, children, all walking calmly into the darkness. And on the walls of that entrance tunnel they'd carved new symbols. Fresh carvings, the rock still pale where it had been chipped away. Symbols we couldn't read, but that made me feel sick to look at, like they meant something terrible, and part of my mind understood even though I consciously couldn't. The search party retreated. A larger, better-equipped expedition was organized, but before it could be mounted, something happened that terrified everyone involved and effectively ended all attempts to discover what had happened to the Ravenhills. 3 days after the initial discovery of the empty settlement, witnesses reported seeing figures on Ravenhill Ridge. Pale figures moving between the trees at twilight. Some swore they were the Ravenhills, returned from wherever they'd gone. Others insisted they were something else, shapes that only resembled humans, shadows given form, manifestations of whatever darkness the family had been communing with all those years. Most disturbing was the testimony of Daniel Kershaw, a hunter who claimed he approached close enough to see the figures clearly. "They weren't solid," he insisted. "They were there, but they weren't properly there, like I was seeing them through smoked glass or fogged water. And they were moving toward the cave entrances, gliding more than walking. I called out, asked if they needed help, and they all stopped and turned toward me. Every one of them at the exact same moment, moving like puppets on the same string. And their faces, God help me, their faces were wrong. The features were in the right places, but they didn't move right, didn't express right. They looked at me with these empty eyes, and then they turned away and walked into the earth, single file, and they were gone." Whether these sightings were genuine paranormal phenomena, mass hallucination brought on by fear and suggestion, or actual survivors of the Ravenhill family playing on local superstition, is impossible to determine now. But the effect was undeniable. Any plans to mount an organized exploration of the tunnels were abandoned. The general consensus became that whatever had happened to the Ravenhills, they'd chosen their fate, and anyone foolish enough to follow them underground was inviting the same mysterious doom. The county officially classified the disappearance as an unexplained mass departure, possibly the family fleeing legal scrutiny related to Thomas Whitmore's death. The settlement was declared abandoned, and over the following years, scavengers stripped the cabins of anything valuable. Eventually, the structures collapsed or were reclaimed by forest, and the location of the Ravenhill settlement became approximate memory rather than precise knowledge. For nearly 4 decades, the tunnels lay undisturbed. The sinkholes gradually filled with debris. The entrances became overgrown. The story passed into local legend, told around fires and used to frighten children into obedience. And the truth of what the Ravenhills had created beneath the Ozark Hills waited in darkness, preserved by accident and fear, until 1894, when flooding would reveal the entrances once more, and curiosity would finally overcome the warnings of the previous generation. The descendants of those who'd known the Ravenhills tried to prevent the exploration. Multiple people urged Sheriff Thorne to seal the entrances immediately without investigating. But Thorne was a man of his time, a believer in scientific explanation and rational thought, and he believed that 40 years of folklore had distorted the truth beyond recognition. He believed that once the tunnels were properly explored and documented, the mystery would resolve into something ordinary, a family of criminals or religious extremists perhaps, but nothing that defied natural explanation. He was wrong, And what he and his men found when they descended into the earth would prove that some stories, no matter how incredible, are closer to truth than skepticism can comfortably accept. Sheriff William Thorne descended into darkness on April 17, 1894, carrying a lantern and a conviction that he was about to solve a 40-year-old mystery. What he actually descended into was something that would challenge every assumption he held about reality, about what humans were capable of, and about what might be waiting in the deep places of the world. The entrance his party chose was one of the largest, a sinkhole that had partially collapsed during spring flooding, revealing a passage that had been hidden for decades. The descent was steep, the wooden steps the Ravenhills had installed still intact despite the passage of time, testimony to the quality of their construction and the dry stability of the cave environment. The air changed immediately upon descent, Thorne recorded in his field journal. It grew cool and carried a mineral smell, typical of caves. But there was something else, a faint odor I couldn't identify, not precisely unpleasant but wrong, organic but not in any way I recognized. The walls of the entrance passage were carved with symbols, the same geometric and linguistic patterns Whitmore had sketched 40 years earlier. They covered every available surface, layered over each other in some places, suggesting they'd been added to over time. The passage opened into a larger tunnel, roughly 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, large enough for easy movement but requiring significant excavation effort to create. Timber supports lined the ceiling at regular intervals, and carved niches in the walls showed where torches or lamps had once rested. The craftsmanship was remarkable, suggesting either expertise in mining or tunnel construction, or years of patient learning through trial and error. We proceeded along the main passage for approximately 300 feet, Thorne wrote. Side passages branched off at regular intervals, but we maintained our course along what appeared to be the central route. The walls continued to display carved symbols, and we began noticing additional elements, painted markings in faded pigments, arrangements of stones set into the walls in patterns, and sections where the rock had been polished smooth, almost glass-like, though what tool or method could achieve this I cannot imagine. The first chamber they encountered was roughly circular, about 20 feet in diameter, with the ceiling rising to a dome. Around the perimeter, carved benches suggested this space had been used for gatherings. In the center, a circle of stones surrounded a depression that showed signs of repeated fires, though nothing remained but ash and charred rock. On the walls of this chamber, Thorne noted, we found what appeared to be a historical record of sorts, carved scenes depicting human figures engaged in various activities. Some showed people descending into the earth. Others showed them gathered in circles, arms raised. Still others depicted scenes I can only describe as transitional, showing figures that were partially human and partially something else, as if transforming into different forms. The artistic style was crude, but the narrative intent was clear. This was a record of the family's activities and beliefs. But it was the side chambers that revealed the true nature of the Ravenhill's obsession. These smaller rooms had been carefully carved and appointed for specific purposes, creating an underground complex that functioned as a self-contained community. One chamber appeared to have been living quarters, carved sleeping niches in the walls, shelves holding decayed remnants of clothing and personal items, and a ventilation shaft ascending toward the surface to provide air flow. The space could have comfortably housed 4 to 6 people, suggesting the family had divided itself among multiple underground chambers, actually living beneath the earth rather than simply using the tunnels for storage or ritual purposes. Another chamber served as a workshop. Thorne's party found remnants of tools, carved wooden implements, and most disturbingly, human bones that had been carefully cleaned and carved with symbols. These were not the bones of the deceased, Thorne was careful to note. The markings and the deliberate nature of their display suggests they were created intentionally, perhaps traded from outside sources or obtained from burial grounds. What purpose they served I cannot determine, but they were clearly important to the family's activities. A third chamber contained what could only be described as a library, though not in any conventional sense. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with carvings, not symbols this time, but what appeared to be text, thousands of characters arranged in columns and rows. If this is writing, Thorne observed, it represents years of labor to produce. The consistency of the characters suggests this is a genuine language, developed or adapted by the Ravenhills. We copied several sections for later analysis, though I hold little hope of translation. Whatever knowledge they recorded here has been lost with the family. As the expedition pushed deeper, following the main passage as it descended further into the earth, the character of the tunnels changed. The early sections had been clearly utilitarian, spaces designed for living and working. But the deeper they went, the more the tunnels seemed designed for other purposes. The walls in the deeper sections are covered almost entirely with carved figures, Thorne wrote. Life-sized human forms carved in relief directly into the limestone walls. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, extending along both walls of the passage as far as our lights could reach. They are arranged in rows, all facing the same direction, deeper into the earth. Their faces are blank without features, but their bodies are depicted in walking poses, suggesting movement, migration, a journey towards something. One of the deputies, a man named Charles Morrison, became increasingly agitated the deeper they went. In his own testimony, given after the expedition, he described experiencing overwhelming dread, a sensation of being watched, and the irrational but powerful conviction that the carved figures were somehow aware of the expedition's presence. "I know how it sounds," Morrison testified, "but I swear on my life those carvings were watching us. Not with eyes, they didn't have eyes, but I felt observed, studied, and judged by hundreds of silent witnesses. And the deeper we went, the stronger the feeling became, until I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think straight. I told the sheriff I was returning to the surface, and I didn't care if that made me a coward." Morrison did return to the surface, along with another deputy who was experiencing similar psychological distress. The remaining members of the expedition continued, driven by a mixture of duty, curiosity, and the unwillingness to retreat without discovering what lay at the heart of the tunnel system. They found it in the deepest accessible chamber, a room that would feature prominently in every nightmare experienced by the survivors for the rest of their lives. The chamber was massive, at least 50 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that rose into darkness beyond the reach of their lantern light. The floor descended in concentric rings, like an amphitheater built in reverse, with each level a foot or so below the previous one, spiraling down toward a central pit. Around this pit, arranged in precise positions, were stone markers, carved monoliths, each about 4 feet tall, covered with symbols that even in the poor light seemed to writhe and shift. The pit itself was perhaps 10 feet in diameter, Thorne recorded. We approached carefully as the edges showed signs of instability. Looking down, we saw that it descended beyond the reach of our light, into darkness so complete that our lanterns seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. We dropped a rock and counted, 14 seconds before we heard it strike bottom, suggesting a depth of at least 300 feet, possibly more. But the pit wasn't the most disturbing element of the chamber. Around the perimeter, carved into the walls in niches spaced at regular intervals, were skeletal remains. Thorne counted 18 distinct skeletons, some clearly human, others, disturbingly, not quite matching human skeletal structure. The bones had been arranged deliberately, positioned in poses that suggested ritual significance. Some of the remains had been carved with symbols after death, Thorne noted. The skulls particularly showed extensive carving, covering nearly every bone surface with intricate patterns. Chemical analysis would be required to determine the age of these remains, but the state of preservation suggests they may have been in this chamber for a considerable time, possibly predating the Ravenhill family's occupation. And covering every inch of the chamber's walls, from floor to ceiling, overlapping and interweaving until the original limestone was completely hidden, were symbols. The same patterns they'd seen throughout the tunnel system, but here rendered in incredible density and complexity, suggesting this chamber represented the culmination of whatever the Ravenhills had been working toward. Looking at those walls, Thorne wrote, I experienced a sensation I can only describe as vertigo of the mind. The symbols seemed to have depth, to suggest meanings that my conscious mind couldn't grasp, but that resonated somewhere deeper. I found myself trying to trace the patterns, to follow the logic of their arrangement, and the more I looked, the more convinced I became that they were communicating something important, something urgent, something that I needed to understand but was fundamentally incapable of comprehending. It was at this moment that the expedition experienced what multiple witnesses would later describe as a collapse, though the exact nature of what happened remains disputed. According to Sheriff Thorne, a section of tunnel ceiling gave way, creating a partial blockage that threatened to trap them underground. According to several deputies, something else occurred. The air grew suddenly cold, the lights dimmed despite adequate fuel, and sounds emanated from the central pit, sounds that resembled voices speaking in rhythm, rising from the depths below. I heard them, testified Deputy Frank Wilson. Voices chanting in that same pattern the old-timers said the Ravenhills used. It wasn't wind. It wasn't our imagination. It was voices, dozens of them coming from down in that pit, calling or warning or inviting. I couldn't tell which. And the sheriff, he heard it too, I know he did, because he went pale and ordered us to evacuate immediately. The expedition retreated in something approaching panic. They navigated back through the tunnels as quickly as safety allowed, and when they emerged into daylight, several of the men broke down, trembling and unable to speak coherently about what they'd experienced. Sheriff Thorne, though maintaining his composure, was clearly shaken in a way that his years of law enforcement experience hadn't prepared him for. They spent the remainder of that day and all of the next debating what to do. Return with better equipment and attempt to map the entire system. Seal the entrance and report it as too dangerous for exploration. Bring in experts from universities or mining operations who might better understand what they'd found. In the end, the decision was made for them. On the third day after the initial descent, several of the expedition members began experiencing what doctors would later classify as acute anxiety attacks. They reported persistent nightmares, inability to sleep, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Most disturbing, 2 men claimed they could still hear the chanting from the pit, even though they were miles from the cave entrance, as if the sound had somehow embedded itself in their minds and would be with them forever. Sheriff Thorne made his recommendation to the county officials. Seal all entrances to the Ravenhill tunnel system immediately, mark the site as hazardous, and strongly discourage any future exploration. His official report, which would mysteriously vanish within a year, reportedly included detailed descriptions of what the expedition had found, along with sketches of the symbols and a warning that whatever the Ravenhill family had been engaged in, it had left a mark on that place that persisted decades after they'd vanished. I am not a superstitious man, Thorne wrote in the conclusion of his report. I do not believe in ghosts or curses or supernatural forces. But I have been in that place, I have seen what they built, and I have felt something in those depths that I cannot explain through any framework of rational thought. Whether the Ravenhills were victims of their own obsession, whether they succeeded in whatever they were attempting, or whether they opened something that should have remained closed, I cannot say. But I recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that this site be sealed and forgotten. Some discoveries diminish us rather than enlighten us, and this is one of them. Within weeks, all known entrances to the tunnel system were filled with rock and debris. Within months, the site was overgrown and becoming difficult to locate. And within a year, Sheriff Thorne's official report had disappeared from the county archives, leaving only secondary accounts and the personal journals of expedition members to document what had been found beneath Ravenhill Ridge. The aftermath of the 1894 exploration was characterized by official silence and unofficial terror. The county government, such as it was in that rural area, took the unusual step of not only sealing the cave entrances, but purchasing the land around Ravenhill Ridge and declaring it unsafe for settlement or development. No explanation was given beyond general geological instability, but the speed and determination with which this was accomplished suggested genuine fear on the part of officials who'd read Thorne's report before it vanished. The men who'd participated in the expedition dealt with their experience in various ways. Several left the region entirely, seeking distance from the place that had disturbed them so profoundly. Others stayed but refused to speak of what they'd seen, deflecting questions or claiming memory had faded. A few became obsessed, spending years trying to research the symbols they'd seen, seeking experts who might translate them or explain them. Sheriff Thorne himself served another 8 years before retiring. His personal journal, discovered after his death, reveals a man haunted by what he'd found beneath the earth. He filled page after page with attempts to recreate the symbols from memory, to find patterns or meaning in their arrangement. He corresponded with folklorists, archaeologists, and religious scholars, describing the carvings and asking if they matched any known language or belief system. The responses he received were uniformly negative. No one recognized the symbols or could offer explanation for their purpose. But the most revealing entries in Thorne's journal are his personal reflections, written late in life. I have spent years trying to understand what the Ravenhills created beneath that ridge, and I am no closer to truth than when I first descended. Were they mad, a family consumed by shared delusion, spending decades carving meaning into stone while believing they were accomplishing something profound? Or did they possess knowledge that we, in our rational modernity, have lost or rejected? The symbols they carved are too consistent, too complex, too deliberate to be mere ravings. They represent something, a language, a map, a ritual text, an invocation. But of what? For what purpose, and most disturbing, did they succeed? I dream of that central chamber. I dream of standing at the edge of that pit, looking down into darkness that seems to extend forever. And in my dreams, I hear voices rising from below, speaking in rhythms that almost make sense, that suggest meaning just beyond my grasp. I wake convinced that the Ravenhills didn't disappear in any conventional sense. They didn't flee. They didn't die. They descended, completing whatever transition they'd been working toward all those years. And if that's true, if they actually accomplished what their carvings suggest they were attempting, then where are they now? In what state? And could they return? Other expedition members left similar testimonies. Frank Wilson, the deputy who'd been most vocal about hearing voices from the pit, developed a fear of enclosed spaces and eventually moved to the plains of Kansas, as far from caves and hills as he could manage. Charles Morrison, who'd felt watched by the carved figures, reportedly told his family on his deathbed that he'd understood something in that final chamber, that the symbols had communicated something to him that he couldn't translate into words but that he'd carried with him ever since, a burden of knowledge that couldn't be shared or shed. The local community around the ridge developed strict taboos regarding the site. Children were warned never to go near it. The few sinkholes that remained visible were avoided. Stories circulated about people who'd ignored the warnings and tried to explore the caves, only to be found days later, wandering and incoherent, speaking about things beneath the earth that shouldn't exist. My grandfather was part of the group that sealed the entrances, testified Margaret Thornton in an interview conducted in the 1950s. He told me once, when he was very old and not entirely lucid, that they'd found things in those tunnels that proved the Ravenhills weren't entirely human, or had become something other than human through whatever they were doing down there. He said they'd found carvings that showed the transformation, human figures gradually changing into forms that didn't match any known creature, as if the family had been documenting their own metamorphosis. He said the sealing of the caves wasn't to keep people out, It was to keep something in. The question of what happened to the Ravenhill family remains, officially, unsolved. Multiple theories exist, each with their proponents and their weaknesses. The skeptical explanation holds that they were simply an eccentric family, possibly religious extremists, who carved the tunnels as a form of obsessive art or spiritual practice. They eventually abandoned their settlement, perhaps fleeing legal trouble, and the tunnels are merely evidence of years of isolated labor, strange but ultimately explicable. The moderate supernatural interpretation suggests they were involved in occult practices, possibly attempting to contact or summon something they believed existed in the earth. They either died in the tunnels, their bodies never found in the unexplored sections, or succeeded in frightening themselves so thoroughly that they fled, sealing the entrances to contain whatever they believed they'd contacted. The more extreme interpretation, whispered but rarely stated directly, holds that the Ravenhills were attempting something that conventional reality doesn't have vocabulary for, a transition between states of existence, a doorway between worlds, a descent into dimensions that intersect with but differ from normal space. According to this view, they succeeded, passing into whatever realm their symbols described and their rituals invoked, leaving behind only the record of their journey carved into limestone walls. Physical evidence supports elements of all these theories without confirming any. The tunnels exist, extensively excavated and decorated. The symbols exist, consistent and complex. The accounts of the 1894 expedition exist in multiple sources, describing phenomena that witnesses genuinely experienced, whether those phenomena were psychological, environmental, or something else entirely. What can be stated with certainty is this. A family lived in isolation in the Missouri Ozarks from 1848 to approximately 1857, during which time they excavated an extensive tunnel system and covered its walls with elaborate symbolic carvings. They disappeared suddenly and completely, under circumstances that were never explained. 40 years later, exploration of their tunnels produced such disturbing findings that official reports were suppressed, and the sites were permanently sealed. And in the decades since, Ravenhill Ridge has maintained a reputation for being dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with geological instability. The legacy of the Ravenhill clan persists in ways that refuse to conform to comfortable explanations. The ridge where they once lived remains officially closed to public access, though enforcement of this restriction is sporadic. The original entrances remain sealed, filled with tons of rock and deliberately made difficult to excavate. But the Ozarks are riddled with caves and sinkholes, and the tunnel system was extensive. New openings appear periodically, revealed by erosion or collapse, and each time the county government responds by sealing them and posting warnings. Modern explorations, both legal and illegal, have added new layers to the mystery. In the 1930s, a team of researchers from a state university obtained permission to conduct a limited survey of the accessible portions of the tunnel system. Their report, unlike Sheriff Thorne's, was published and remains available in archaeological archives. It confirms the basic facts: extensive human excavation, elaborate symbolic carvings, evidence of long-term underground habitation. But it also notes elements that Thorne's expedition apparently missed or chose not to report. The tunnel system appears to follow a deliberate geometric pattern, the 1930s report states, with passages radiating from a central point in precise angular relationships. The layout suggests advanced understanding of geometry and possibly astronomical alignment, though what specific celestial configurations might be represented remains unclear. The sophistication of the design is inconsistent with the frontier education level, typically associated with settlers of this period and region. The report also documented something Sheriff Thorne didn't mention: evidence that the tunnel system connects with natural cave formations extending for miles beneath the ridge, creating a network far larger than what the Ravenhills could have excavated themselves. The family apparently discovered and exploited an existing cave system, the researchers concluded, expanding and modifying it for their purposes. The deepest sections of natural cave remain unexplored, as modern safety standards and equipment limitations prevent access. This raises disturbing questions. If the Ravenhills were working within an already extensive cave system, how deep does it go? What might exist in the unexplored sections? And were the symbols they carved throughout the accessible areas extending into natural formations they discovered below? One member of the 1930s research team, Dr. Harold Kensington, published a separate paper years later that took a more speculative approach. He'd spent months analyzing the Kopid symbols and believed he'd identified patterns suggesting astronomical or cosmological meanings. The Ravenhill carvings, he argued, represent an attempt to map something, not surface geography, but relationships between states or dimensions that they believed existed beyond normal perception. Whether this was purely symbolic, representing abstract philosophical concepts, or whether they genuinely believed they were documenting real places or entities is impossible to determine. But the consistency and complexity of the symbol system suggests it was meaningful to them, that it represented a coherent worldview, however alien that worldview might be to conventional thinking. Dr. Kensington also noted something that subsequent researchers would confirm. The symbols throughout the tunnel system aren't random or decorative. They follow a progression, growing more complex the deeper into the earth they were carved. It's as if the Ravenhills were documenting a journey, Kensington wrote, with the early, accessible carvings representing basic concepts or entry points, and the deeper carvings representing more advanced or final stages of whatever process they were engaged in. If the symbols could be fully translated, they would tell a story, one that begins on the surface and ends in the deepest chamber, at the edge of that central pit. But translation has proven impossible. Multiple linguists and cryptographers have attempted to decode the symbols over the decades, treating them as potential language, cipher, or mathematical notation. None have succeeded in producing translations that are verifiable or consistent. The symbols remain as mysterious today as when they were first discovered, resistant to every analytical approach applied to them. Modern accounts continue to add to the Ravenhill mystery. Hikers in the region report strange phenomena near the ridge, sounds emanating from the ground, areas of unusual warmth or cold, electronic equipment malfunctioning, and that persistent sensation of being watched by something unseen. These reports are consistent enough that they can't be entirely dismissed as imagination, yet they provide no hard evidence of anything genuinely anomalous. More disturbing are accounts from people who have found and entered unsealed portions of the tunnel system, despite warnings and legal restrictions. A group of cave explorers in the 1980s spent several hours in the tunnels before becoming disoriented and barely finding their way back to the surface. They reported seeing things they couldn't adequately describe, shapes moving in the darkness beyond their lights, sounds that seemed to have no source, and in the deepest section they reached, carvings that they swore hadn't been there when they passed the first time, as if new symbols were appearing while they explored. "I know how insane it sounds," one of the explorers said in an interview, "but I've been caving for 20 years. I know limestone formations, I know how light plays tricks, I know how acoustics work underground. What we experienced in those tunnels wasn't typical cave phenomena. There's something wrong with that place, something that's been wrong since before the Ravenhills arrived, and that they somehow made worse through whatever they were doing down there." In 2003, a research team using ground-penetrating radar mapped the tunnel system from the surface, attempting to determine its extent without actually entering it. Their results were simultaneously enlightening and frustrating. The system is vast, far more extensive than anyone had realized, with passages extending for miles in multiple directions and descending to depths of at least 400 feet, possibly more. The passages do follow geometric patterns, confirming earlier observations. But the radar also detected anomalies, spaces that register as voids but show properties inconsistent with normal air-filled chambers, as if something in the deepest sections is interfering with the radar waves in ways the researchers couldn't explain. Standard ground-penetrating radar shouldn't produce the readings we got, the lead researcher stated. Either there's some geological feature down there that's affecting the radar in unusual ways, or our equipment was malfunctioning, though we tested it extensively and found nothing wrong. The third possibility, which I hesitate to mention, is that there's something in those deep chambers that affects electromagnetic radiation in ways that natural rock formations don't. What that something might be, I couldn't begin to guess. The most recent significant incident occurred in 2019, when a sinkhole opened on private property adjacent to Ravenhill Ridge, revealing a previously unknown entrance to the tunnel system. Before it could be sealed, several teenagers explored the opening with smartphones and cameras. The footage they captured, shared on social media before being widely copied and eventually removed by the original posters, shows the familiar carved walls and symbols. But in several frames, visible in the background beyond the teenagers' flashlights, shapes appear. Dark, vertical forms that could be natural rock features or could be something else. The teenagers insisted they saw nothing unusual while filming, that the shapes only appeared when they reviewed the footage later. "We were just exploring," one of them said. "It seemed cool, like finding a piece of history. But when we watched the video afterward and saw those things in the background, standing in the tunnels behind us while we were joking around, it made my blood run cold. Because whatever they were watching us. And they were there the whole time, even though we never saw them." The entrance was sealed within days of the incident becoming public. County officials cited safety concerns, but locals suggested the speed of the response indicated genuine fear that something might emerge from the tunnels if left open, or that explorers might venture too deep and release something that the Ravenhills had bound or contained through their symbols and rituals. Today, Ravenhill Ridge remains a place of fear and fascination. It's featured in documentaries about unsolved mysteries, discussed in forums dedicated to paranormal phenomena, and visited by adventurers willing to risk legal trouble for the chance to explore the sealed tunnels. Most find nothing. The entrances are well sealed, surveillance is sporadic but real, and the dangers of illegal cave exploration in unstable systems are genuine. But occasionally, someone finds an opening. And occasionally, they emerge with stories that add to the legend, stories of symbols that seem to move in peripheral vision, of sounds rising from depths that shouldn't exist, of the persistent conviction that the Ravenhills never really left, that they're still down there in some form, still carving their symbols, still working toward whatever completion they sought a century and a half ago. The question remains, what were they doing? Were the Ravenhills visionaries or madmen, mystics or victims of shared delusion? Did they discover something genuine in the darkness beneath the Ozarks? Some truth or presence or possibility that conventional reality can't accommodate? Or did they simply create an elaborate monument to obsession, spending decades carving meaning into stone, while convincing themselves they were achieving something profound? Perhaps the answer lies in those unexplored depths, in the sections of tunnel that were too dangerous or too deep for Sheriff Thorne's expedition or any subsequent exploration. Perhaps the central pit that descends hundreds of feet into darkness leads somewhere, connects to something, opens onto some space or state that the Ravenhills believed existed and dedicated their lives to reaching. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and sadder, a family consumed by belief, isolating themselves from society, spending their lives in darkness both literal and metaphorical, until they finally descended too far and simply died in the earth they'd made their obsession, their bodies lost in collapsed passages or subterranean rivers, their story transformed by time and fear into something more mysterious than the reality of human frailty and misguided faith. We may never know. The tunnels remain sealed, the symbols untranslated, the fate of the family unconfirmed. And in the end, perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries serve us better unsolved, existing as reminders that the world contains more than we understand, that human motivation can drive people to extremes that defy explanation, and that beneath the surface of ordinary land, strange histories can lie buried, waiting for the curious or the foolish to uncover them. The Ravenhill clan came to the Missouri Ozarks in 1848, carved a labyrinth beneath the earth, and vanished into the darkness they'd created. What they found there, what they became there, what they left behind, these questions linger, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, written in symbols on limestone walls that have outlasted the people who carved them and will outlast anyone who tries to understand them. And deep in the earth, in chambers sealed and forgotten, in passages that descend beyond the reach of light or reason, the symbols wait, patient, silent, eternal. Some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Some journeys once begun continue long after the travelers have vanished. And some places retain the mark of what was done there, no matter how much time passes or how thoroughly we try to forget. Ravenhill Ridge remembers. The earth remembers. And if you stand quietly on that ridge at twilight, when the light is fading and the forest grows still, you might hear something faint and rhythmic, like voices chanting in unison, rising from beneath your feet, from the tunnels that were never fully explored and never truly abandoned. The Ravenhills may be gone, but what they were doing, what they were calling to, what they were trying to become, that remains, carved into stone, waiting in darkness, a mystery that refuses to die because it was never meant to. This has been the story of the Ravenhill clan and what investigators found in their tunnels that still terrifies everyone who knows the full truth. May those tunnels stay sealed. May those symbols remain untranslated. And may we never discover whether the Ravenhills succeeded in reaching whatever destination their obsession led them toward. Because some answers, once known, can't be unknown, and some destinations, once reached, become inescapable.